I understand this is a shock, but the terms are final.
Do we have an agreement?
I hope this helps. Please, eat well. Thank you.
In the restless city of Port Harcourt, where mornings began before sunrise and survival was louder than hope, a young woman named Blessing stood every day beneath a tired red umbrella tied together with old rope and nylon, its fabric torn like the stories of the people who passed beneath it. And at just 22 years old, life had already taught her lessons many never learned in a lifetime: loss, hunger, silence, and strength, because Blessing had no parents to run home to, no safety net waiting for her at night, only a single zinc-roofed room that leaked during rainstorms and burned like firewood when the sun climbed high, a room with no fan, no electricity, no comfort beyond a thin mattress laid directly on the cold floor and a frying pan hanging from a nail on the wall. Yet that pan was more than metal to her, it was survival itself, because every morning before the city fully woke, Blessing swept her floor, whispered a short prayer, tied her wrapper tightly around her waist, balanced a basin of blended beans on her head, and walked to the noisy bus stop where engines roared, conductors shouted, and students rushed past without seeing her struggle, and there she lit her small stove, mixed onions and pepper into the beans with steady hands, and dropped her first scoop into hot oil, the sizzling sound rising like music in a place where joy was rare, because Blessing fried akara not just to eat but to live, and though each piece was small, people said it tasted like peace, maybe because it was made by someone who had learned to smile even while standing on broken ground, for despite her poverty she carried something many rich people lacked, a gentle heart, one that had been shaped by pain from childhood when her parents died suddenly, leaving her to grow up under the roof of an aunt who treated her less like family and more like a burden, until at 17 Blessing chose the uncertainty of the streets over a life without dignity, and so every morning customers gathered around her stand, laughing at her jokes, teasing her gently, calling her by name, because even when her pockets were empty, Blessing gave people warmth, and yet among the crowd there was one presence that never moved, one figure who sat quietly beside a rusted fence on a low stool, a blind old man with eyes that stared into nothing and a walking stick resting against his knee, known only as Baba Caro, a man no one asked about and no one truly saw, because he never begged and never complained, and while others ignored him or whispered rumors, Blessing noticed his silence, his dignity, the way he came every single morning without fail, and so after serving her first few customers she always scooped 2 hot pieces of akara, wrapped them in old newspaper, and placed them gently into his waiting hands, saying softly, "Good morning, Baba," and he would smile faintly and reply, "Your spirit is gentle, my daughter," words she never took pride in and never announced. Because to Blessing kindness was not an act, it was simply right, even when people mocked her, even when they said she was foolish for feeding someone who could give her nothing in return, even when hunger waited for her at night, because Blessing believed, without knowing why, that goodness mattered even if no one rewarded it, and as the sun climbed higher and the city grew louder she continued frying, selling, smiling, unaware that beneath that broken red umbrella, under the dust and noise of ordinary days, her quiet acts were already planting seeds that would one day shake her entire world. Morning returned to Port Harcourt with its usual chaos, engines coughing awake, hawkers shouting prices into the air, and the restless feet of people chasing survival, but for Blessing the rhythm of the day had already become familiar, almost sacred, as she stood under her red umbrella stirring beans and oil, greeting customers with a smile that hid exhaustion, yet every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the rusted fence where Baba Caro sat unmoving on his low stool, facing the same direction. As always, like a man listening to a voice no one else could hear, and though he never raised his hand or opened his mouth to beg, Blessing felt an unspoken hunger around him, not just for food but for dignity, because while others tossed insults or coins at beggars, Baba Caro did neither receive nor demand anything, he simply existed quietly, absorbing the cruelty and indifference of the world without complaint, and that silence disturbed Blessing more than loud suffering ever could, so when she handed him akara each morning she did it gently, never announcing it, never calling attention, placing the food in his palm as if feeding an equal, and Baba Caro always paused before eating, as if saying a prayer in his heart, then smiled faintly, whispering words that stayed with her long after the oil cooled, words like, "May your kindness return to you in ways you cannot imagine," even as nearby traders laughed, shook their heads, and accused her of foolishness, saying a poor girl should not carry the burden of charity, but Blessing had learned early in life that silence was sometimes louder than arguments, and so she continued, day after day, rain or shine, even on mornings when she had sold nothing and her stomach burned with hunger, because something inside her refused to let the old man go without food, and as days passed, she began to notice details others ignored, like how Baba Caro's clothes were always clean despite their age, how his posture never bent like a true beggar's, how his walking stick seemed more like a prop than a necessity, but Blessing never questioned it, because she believed people were allowed their secrets, and as the city moved around them like a river, their quiet routine became invisible to everyone except the two of them. Until one afternoon dark clouds gathered and rain threatened to pour, and traders rushed to pack their goods, yet Blessing noticed Baba Caro still seated, unmoving, exposed to the coming storm, and without thinking. She grabbed an extra nylon sheet and draped it over his shoulders, shielding him as best she could while shivering herself beneath her torn umbrella, and though her hands shook from cold she still placed Accra in his palm, and that was the moment something changed. Because Baba Caro's smile lingered longer than usual, his fingers tightening slightly around her wrist as he said, "Some people walk past suffering every day, but you stop," words that echoed in her heart long after the rain fell. And that evening as Blessing walked home through muddy streets, slippers worn thin, wrappers stained with oil, she wondered why his presence mattered so much to her when she barely knew him, yet she felt connected to him in a way she could not explain, perhaps because they were both invisible in different ways, both surviving quietly in a city that rarely stopped to care, and that night as she lay on her mat listening to buses roar in the distance, her mind returned again to Baba Caro, to his calm voice, his strange dignity, and the unshakable feeling that he was not just another poor man by the roadside, but someone watching, waiting, measuring the world not by money or power, but by how it treated those it believed were worthless. And though Blessing slept without answers, one truth settled deep within her spirit: whatever this life was preparing, whatever storms or blessings lay ahead, her kindness had already stepped into something far bigger than she could see. The morning Baba Caro did not come, the city still woke up the same way it always did, loud and careless, engines roaring, conductors shouting destinations, traders arguing over prices, yet for Blessing something felt wrong even before she stepped out of her zinc room, as if the air itself carried a quiet warning, and though she tried to ignore it she moved faster than usual, bathing with cold water, tying her wrapper, lifting the basin of beans onto her head, whispering a short prayer that felt heavier than normal, and when she reached the bus stop and set up her bench beneath the red umbrella she instinctively looked to the right, toward the rusted fence, expecting to see the familiar low stool and the still figure facing the road, but the space was empty, painfully empty, and at first she told herself he was late, because Baba Caro had never missed a day, not even when rain soaked the ground or sickness hung in the air, so she lit her stove, mixed her beans, and dropped the first scoop into the oil, yet the sizzling sound that once comforted her now felt distant, hollow, and every few minutes her eyes returned to the empty spot, her chest tightening each time, until she finally asked a nearby trader if he had seen the blind man that morning, only to receive a casual shake of the head, followed by another, and another, until it became clear that no one had seen Baba Caro since the previous day, and panic began to rise quietly inside her, twisting her thoughts. Because she knew something was wrong, a knowing that did not come from logic but from the heart, and as customers came and went she found herself distracted, burning Accra without noticing, apologizing without smiling, her jokes falling flat, and when smoke rose from the pan it was a neighbor who called her attention back, scolding her gently, but even then her eyes drifted again to the rusted fence, the empty stool now feeling like a grave marker for something she could not name, and all day long the city moved around her while her spirit remained stuck in that one silent space, wondering if Baba Caro had fallen sick, if someone had harmed him, if he had died alone without anyone noticing, and the thought made her throat ache, because she realized how little she truly knew about him, not his home, not his past, not even his real name, only that he sat there every day and accepted kindness without asking, and that night she returned to her room restless and unable to sleep, lying on her mat with eyes wide open as mosquitoes buzzed and the heat pressed down on her chest, whispering prayers she did not know how to finish, begging God to keep the old man safe, even though she could not explain why his absence hurt her more than her own hunger ever had. And when morning came again she woke even earlier, determined to wait for him, reaching the bus stop before dawn and standing alone beneath the umbrella as the sky slowly changed color. But when 7 o'clock passed and Baba Caro still did not appear, something inside her broke, and she finally accepted what others dismissed. This was not normal, and though people told her to forget it, to mind her business, to focus on survival, Blessing felt a pull she could not ignore, a quiet voice urging her to search, to ask, To move beyond the safety of routine, because the kindness she had given without thought had now bound her heart to a man who had vanished without a trace, and as she packed her things that evening with trembling hands, she made a decision that would change everything, a decision to step out of her small, predictable world and into the unknown, because some absences are louder than presence, and Babacaro's empty stool had become a question she could no longer live without answering. Blessing had never gone looking for anyone in her life, but that evening she tied her hair back, removed her apron, and stepped into the streets with a restlessness that refused to let her sit still, moving from one junction to another, asking strangers about a blind old man who sat near a bus stop, receiving mostly shrugs, laughter, and careless dismissals, until exhaustion crept into her legs and tears burned behind her eyes, yet even after returning to her small room with dirty feet and soaked clothes she could not rest, because the unanswered question of Babacaro's disappearance clung to her spirit like a shadow, and so when the next day arrived she returned to her stand with heavy eyes and shaking hands, her mind divided between frying akara and scanning faces. Until suddenly the noise of the street seemed to slow when a sleek black Jeep pulled up beside her stand, its polished body and tinted windows completely out of place among the dust and chaos, and as people whispered and stared, a well-dressed young man stepped out, his shoes shining, his voice calm as he asked for her by name, confirming her identity before handing her a brown envelope with instructions that made her heart pound, telling her to read it alone and not speak of it to anyone, then leaving without explanation. And as the vehicle disappeared into traffic, Blessing stood frozen, clutching the envelope like something alive, her thoughts racing with fear and confusion, because nothing in her life had ever arrived wrapped in secrecy or luxury, and when she finally slipped into a quiet alley and opened it, her breath caught as she read the message inviting her to a high-end hotel by evening, signed simply as from an old friend, and immediately her mind raced to Babacaro, the only old friend she could think of, yet the idea felt impossible, ridiculous even, and still her heart would not calm, because something deep inside her told her this was connected, and for the rest of the day nothing went right. Her akara tasted wrong, her hands spilled salt and water, customers complained, and time dragged painfully until 4 o'clock arrived and she rushed home, bathing quickly, wearing her only good dress, whispering prayers she did not fully understand, and when she reached the towering hotel and stepped inside a lift for the first time in her life, fear and wonder twisted together in her chest, and by the time she reached room 406 her knees were weak, her palms sweating, and when the door finally opened and she saw Babacaro sitting there transformed, clean, composed, dressed in crisp white, his eyes clear and alive, her world cracked open in an instant, because nothing she believed about him made sense anymore, and as he calmly revealed that he was never blind, that his life by the bus stop had been a test of humanity rather than a necessity, Blessing felt shock ripple through her entire body, her mind struggling to reconcile the quiet old man she fed with the powerful presence now before her, and when he spoke of wealth, of businesses, of watching people in disguise to see who would show kindness without reward, the truth settled slowly and painfully, because she realized that the man she had worried over, prayed for, and searched for was not lost or helpless, but watching, waiting, measuring hearts, and as he placed documents and an envelope before her, revealing that her kindness had earned her more than gratitude, it had earned her a future, Blessing could no longer stand, collapsing into tears that came from years of silent struggle finally being seen, and in that moment she understood that life had been testing her too, not with riches or comfort, but with choices made in poverty, choices no one applauded, and now those unseen moments were returning to her louder than the noise of the city ever had. Blessing sat in the quiet luxury of the hotel room with her hands locked together on her lap, her heart racing faster than her thoughts as Chief Obina Carlos spoke calmly, patiently, explaining a world she had never imagined entering, a world where money moved silently and power wore clean clothes. Yet as he talked about investments, foundations, and influence, Blessing's mind kept drifting back to the dusty bus stop, to the cracked pavement beneath her slippers, to the oil-stained wrapper she wore every day, because nothing about her past aligned with what was unfolding before her eyes. And when he slid the documents toward her and told her a restaurant now carried her name, that it was fully registered, staffed, furnished, and valued beyond anything she had ever touched, her breath left her body in a quiet gasp, her fingers trembling as she read words that felt unreal, ownership, CEO, millions, and for a moment fear overtook gratitude, because she did not feel worthy of such a gift. And she said so, her voice breaking as she confessed she had no education, no experience, no confidence to lead something so big, and Chief Obina listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his expression gentle, before telling her that kindness was a qualification no school could teach, that discipline, humility, and consistency mattered more than grammar or certificates, and that her daily choice to give without expecting anything had proven her character beyond doubt. And as she cried openly, he reassured her that she would not walk alone, that managers, mentors, and systems were already in place, that her role was not to pretend to be something she wasn't, but to grow into what life had prepared her for all along. And slowly, painfully, the truth began to sink in. Not that she was suddenly rich, but that her suffering had not been wasted, that every insult swallowed, every hungry night endured, every act of quiet generosity had been seen, measured, and returned. And when she finally stood to leave the room, escorted by a driver and carrying an envelope heavier than any money she had ever held, the city outside looked different, brighter yet unfamiliar, as if she had crossed an invisible border between survival and possibility. And that night in the new apartment arranged for her, Blessing walked barefoot across clean tiles, touching walls and furniture like they might disappear, falling to her knees and crying not out of excitement but fear, because change, even good change, can terrify those who have only known struggle. And she whispered prayers filled with doubt and gratitude intertwined, asking God not why she had been blessed, but how she could carry it without losing herself. And the next morning, when a black SUV arrived to take her to her restaurant for the first time, neighbors stared in disbelief as she stepped out dressed simply, her posture unsure, her eyes wide. And as the car moved through familiar streets, she watched the city she once walked now pass by her window, the bus stops, the markets, the corners where hunger lived. And when the vehicle finally stopped before a white building with tall glass windows and gold letters spelling out Sweet Joy Kitchen, her knees weakened again, because the name alone felt like a testimony carved in stone. And as staff bowed and welcomed her as madam, she struggled to respond, still adjusting to a title she never asked for. And when she entered her office and saw her name printed boldly on the door, CEO Blessing Chiggy, something inside her shifted permanently, because for the first time in her life her name was not attached to poverty or pity, but to authority and trust. And as she sat behind the desk overlooking the restaurant floor below, watching people work under her leadership, she realized that kindness had not only changed her circumstances, it had placed responsibility in her hands, because blessings that are not shared become burdens. And as tears rolled quietly down her face, she made a silent promise that whatever this new life became, it would never erase the girl under the red umbrella, because that girl was the reason this moment existed at all. Success came quickly, but it did not arrive loudly in Blessing's heart, because even as Sweet Joy Kitchen flourished and customers lined up daily for meals prepared with care, she carried within her the quiet memory of hunger. And every signature she placed on documents, every salary she approved, every respectful good morning, madam, reminded her how fragile life once felt. And though money now surrounded her, comfort did not erase conscience, because each morning when sunlight poured through the glass windows of her office, her thoughts wandered back to the streets where survival had shaped her, to the bus stop where oil once sizzled under a torn umbrella, and to the man who had watched silently while testing hearts. And one evening after the restaurant closed and the staff prepared to leave, Blessing called her manager and spoke with a calm certainty that surprised even herself, explaining her desire to start something beyond profit, something rooted in remembrance, because she understood now that wealth without purpose was just another form of emptiness. And so within weeks Blessing's basket was born, a simple idea carried by a powerful intention, to feed the forgotten. And every Friday a clean white food van left Sweet Joy Kitchen loaded with warm meals, clean water, and volunteers ready to serve without cameras or applause. And Blessing often joined them herself, dressed simply, kneeling to hand food directly into tired hands, looking into eyes others avoided, and with every smile returned and every whispered prayer spoken over her, she felt something inside her settle, because she was no longer afraid of losing what she had gained. And as stories of her generosity spread, people spoke not just of her rise from Accra seller to CEO, but of her refusal to forget where she came from. And yet the most powerful moment came quietly one early morning when she returned alone to her old street, wrapped in a scarf, standing before the rusted fence where the low stool once sat, the air still heavy with memories. And as she knelt there she understood fully that Baba Caro had never been the miracle, kindness was. And she whispered a thank you not for money, but for the test she passed without knowing she was being examined. And as she stood to leave, a young girl selling oranges spoke words that echoed truth she would carry forever, that when God visits people, he often comes dressed as need. And Blessing walked away with a smile that carried both humility and strength, because she knew her life was no longer about escaping poverty, but about shortening its reach for others. And as awards, interviews, and recognition followed, she accepted them gently, always redirecting attention to the power of unseen goodness. Because deep inside she knew that the world did not change through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency, through the decision to care when it is inconvenient, through hands that give even when empty, and in that understanding. Blessing finally found peace, not in wealth, but in alignment, because the same hand that once gave Accra without expectation was now feeding many, proving that when kindness is returned, it multiplies far beyond the one who first gave it. On the night Blessing stood on a brightly lit stage, wearing a gold dress that shimmered like the future she never imagined, applause thundered through the hall as her name was announced as Businesswoman of the Year, yet as cameras flashed and people rose to their feet, her mind drifted far from the polished floor beneath her heels and returned instead to the cracked pavement of a noisy bus stop, to the smell of hot oil, to the red umbrella tied with rope, because she understood something many never do, that this moment was not born from luck or charity, but from character tested in obscurity, and when she finally spoke into the microphone she did not lift the trophy high or speak of success in numbers, she spoke of hunger, of silence, of the version of herself the world never applauded, the girl who gave food to a man everyone else ignored, not knowing she was being watched, not hoping for reward, and as her words spread beyond the hall into homes and phones and hearts, something shifted quietly in the city, because people began to see themselves in her story, to remember moments they had walked past pain without stopping, and somewhere far away Chief Obina Carlos watched the broadcast in silence, a small satisfied smile on his face, knowing the test had never truly been about money but about what power would reveal once placed in her hands, and the days that followed proved him right, because Blessing did not retreat into comfort or forget the streets, instead she expanded her foundation, trained young women who reminded her of herself, supported widows, paid school fees quietly, and returned again and again to the forgotten corners of the city, not as a savior but as proof that kindness survives even after success. And one quiet morning she sat alone in her office as sunlight painted the room gold, staring at her reflection in the glass, whispering a truth she now lived by, that God had not blessed her to escape the world, but to serve it better, and later that day she visited her old neighborhood without announcement, standing again near the rusted fence where a blind man once sat, closing her eyes as memories flooded back, realizing that the greatest transformation was not her bank account or her title, but her understanding that every human interaction is a test in disguise, because we never know who is watching, who is waiting, or which moment will echo into our future, and as she walked away a child's voice called out asking if she was the blessing from the story everyone talked about, and she smiled gently, kneeling to the child's level and saying yes, before adding softly that the real blessing was choosing to do good even when it feels pointless, and in that moment the story completed its circle, because the girl who once fed a stranger now fed a city with hope, proving that kindness is never wasted, only delayed, and that the world does not change when we recognize greatness, it changes when we treat everyone as if they already have it, because sometimes the blind man by the roadside is a billionaire in disguise, and sometimes the poor girl under the red umbrella is a leader the future has been waiting for, and so the lesson of Blessing's life traveled quietly from heart to heart, reminding all who heard it that the true test of humanity is not how we treat the powerful, but how we treat those who can offer us nothing at all.